Okay, so Pet Sematary 2 is, well, it's not, it wasn't as bad as I had expected. However, when you have the lowest of sublithospheric expectations, it's not exactly difficult to exceed said expectations. So there is that to consider. But rather than do what comes naturally and throw copious amounts of shade at this lesser-known Stephen King movie sequel, I want to talk about what they got right, provide some constructive criticisms, and do my best not to erupt into an angry tangent about what an absolute waste of my f***ing time this horrendous puddle of elephant spittle excuse for a movie this was. Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. As my earlier air quotes indicated, and any King fan knows, Pet Sematary 2 is not a Stephen King movie. King never penned a story or a screenplay for a sequel to Pet Sematary. King had nothing to do with this movie, and I think it's important that we get that out of the way right up front. King is in no way at fault for this movie. In fact, King made sure to have his name removed from the movie entirely prior to its release. Honestly, I don't understand why this commandeering of intellectual property is even legal, or if King was in any way compensated for establishing the setting, premise, and reference material. But the fact of the matter is, the movie exists, and we all have to live with that, so we might as well make the most of it. Pet Sematary 2, a brief summary. Sometimes dead is better, but the shocking terror that plagued Ludlow, Maine in Pet Sematary is still very much alive in this heart-stopping sequel. After the death of his wife, veterinarian Chase Matthews and his 13-year-old son Jeff moved to Ludlow to rebuild their lives. Antagonized by the neighborhood kids, Jeff befriends another outsider, Drew Gilbert, who lives in fear of his cruel stepfather. After Gus cold-bloodedly shoots Drew's beloved dog, the boys bury the body in the local Indian burial grounds, a place rumored to have powers of resurrection. When evil is awakened, the boys realize that sometimes you should just let dead dogs lie. History and background. Following the success of the first Pet Sematary movie a few years earlier in 1989, Paramount was eager to cash in on some more King-related content, so they re-enlisted the director of the first movie, Mary Lambert, to take the reins. Initially, Lambert had intended to bring back Ellie, the sole surviving member of the Creed family from the first Pet Sematary book and movie, the only Pet Sematary. You get it. And to expand on her story. Paramount didn't agree with the decision to include Ellie Creed, however, and screenwriter Richard Oughton was brought in to write a new story featuring all new characters. Oughton's career prior to and for quite some time following Pet Sematary 2 is spotty and not what I would consider consistent. As far as feature-length films go, it appears that his only other credited work is on Little Nemo: Adventures in Slumberland. Not that Nemo. That's the one. And then years later, he was credited for writing the screenplay for the Journey to the Center of the Earth sequel, Journey to the Mysterious Island. Outside of that, it's pretty obscure. The movie starred Edward Furlong, who had just burst on the scene a year earlier in Terminator 2 Judgment Day, as well as Anthony Edwards, best known for his award-winning role in the hit TV show ER, and Clancy Brown, who is also in The Shawshank Redemption, Starship Troopers, and most importantly is the voice of Mr. Krabs on SpongeBob. The movie had a budget of $8 million and grossed $17 million at the box office. Critics were understandably not impressed with the movie. However, some felt it was actually better than the original Pet Sematary movie. A critic from Variety wrote, quote, "Pet Sematary 2 is about 50% better than its predecessor, which is to say it's not very good at all." Unquote. Talk about a backhanded compliment. Another critic, Jay Carr of the Boston Globe, called the movie, quote, "better entertainment than the first Pet Sematary, but more of a remake than a sequel," unquote. I was surprised that there were at least two people who thought this was a better movie, but hey, to each their own. I'm willing to admit that the original was by no means a perfect movie or even one of my personal favorites. I'm not here to defend Pet Sematary, but is the sequel better than the original? Maybe. Consistently inconsistent. Alright, so as I had originally explained, I have every intention of giving this movie a fair shake rather than just complaining about its shortcomings. My knee-jerk reaction to most King movies that aren't actually King movies is to just tear them to shreds. But I'm going to make an effort here to provide some actual criticism alongside some positive remarks in a good faith effort to make a fair and balanced critique. The biggest issue that this movie suffers from is inconsistency. The filmmakers seemingly understand how to make something work, and they execute that thing with relative competence, only to find a way to screw up a similar concept or idea later on in the film. Or in some instances, they introduce a theme or idea to the movie that is done poorly and then bring that idea back and do it well later on. In the first seconds of the movie, as I watched the title animation develop onto the screen, I felt immediate concern for things to come. But mere seconds later, the intro credits started, and the shaky animation style that they used, paired with the Danny Elfman-esque score, was unique and foreboding. There is an electrocution scene early on that isn't believable or well executed, but they do another electrocution scene later on that is over the top and entertaining. Even if the special effects of the second electrocution aren't necessarily flawlessly executed, it's a huge improvement from the first instance. And this inconsistency with special effects is true across the board throughout the movie. There are some gruesomely gory makeup effects, even some inventive camera tricks. And the evil dog Zowie is honestly fucking terrifying a lot of the time. But as if to balance the scales, there are also a number of dated editing techniques, remarkably subpar puppetry, and low-quality practical effects. However, the movie is almost entirely free of low-budget early 90s CGI, and if given the choice, I would invariably choose to be subjected to all of the aforementioned shortcomings rather than bad CGI. The acting is, in regards to quality of performance, all over the place. Aside from Edward Furlong, all of the young actors are inept and clearly inexperienced. The bully character in particular is insufferable, but that is at least in part due to the fact that his dialogue and character are overblown caricatures of a school bully. The majority of the adult cast members, Anthony Edwards and Clancy Brown specifically, deliver reliably solid performances. Unlike the school bully, Brown is believable and not as aggressively overblown in his cruelty, which gives his character some menace. He does eventually go over the top, but Brown does a good job despite perhaps having some goofy dialogue in the latter half of the movie, which brings us to our next inconsistency. The last quarter of the movie is full of goofball jokes and gags that cause a complete and total tone shift. It's Brown's character specifically who becomes a lunatic joker whose dialogue is entirely comprised of one-liners and puns that are played for laughs, but at no earlier point in the film was there any indication that they were leaning into or even going to dip their toes into the black comedy pond. Pet Sematary 2 becomes a conflicted movie that wants to be taken very seriously while simultaneously portraying one character as some sort of unwelcome comic relief, and it just doesn't work when considering the entirety of the movie prior to this one specific character's pivot. Final thoughts. Honestly, if Pet Sematary 2 had a more competent cast and had maintained a consistent tone, it would have been, at the very least, a watchable movie. However, were the two most glaring flaws removed, it still would have been, at best, just a watchable movie. Not remarkable or brilliant or memorable, just watchable. I will say that when it comes to movies that appropriate King's work and attempt to build on the existing source material, absent King's input or involvement, this was perhaps the least awful example I've watched for this channel so far. And while that may sound like faint praise, I assure you the bar was set so incredibly low that it isn't too difficult for a movie like Pet Sematary to stumble over it. Next week, I'll be taking a look at the 2019 movie remake of Pet Sematary. The first time I watched this movie, I had just finished reading the book, and so I found myself being hypercritical whenever the movie went off book, and I have a hard time remembering anything aside from how it wasn't a strict retelling. So I've decided that when rewatching the movie, I'm going to treat it as its own thing and give it an opportunity to stand on its own merits and not compare it to the story in an apples-to-apples sort of way. New videos drop on this channel every Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so be all that you can be. And subscribe to the channel so you get notifications. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty pleased with blood and guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.